Good evening to all. Thank you for coming. You could have been anywhere this evening, but you chose to be here. I personally appreciate it. Thank you. Twibuke twiyubaka. Remember, unite, and renew. The story I will share with you, it's not only my story, but the story is similar to many. Before the 1994 genocide against Tutsi, I was a happy child. I had a happy childhood. I was a kid who enjoyed spending time with my siblings, my cousins, friends. I especially enjoyed spending time at my grandfather's house for the holidays. When the genocide started, I was only 13 years old. I was in Kigali, in my hometown of Kimisange. We were three families closely connected, my father's house and my two uncles' house. A week before the genocide started, I was at my grandfather's house in Kabuga, Rusororo. My grandfather was a Seventh-day Adventist pastor, Pastor Bgiruka. Like I mentioned earlier, being at my grandfather's house was always every child's favorite pastime. However, one day I woke up with the urgency and the need to want to see my father. I missed him terribly. I had never felt like that before. So I asked for permission to go, and I left my sister behind, my older sister Wera behind, and my older brother Rukaka at my grandfather's house. In less than 1 week after arriving my parents' home, the genocide started. I remember one morning my father was listening to a radio, and I remember the look on his face. The reason I remember the look on his face is because as a child, I remember my father being a happy person, always smiling, especially when I would run to him. This time he wasn't smiling. Something was troubling him. After listening to the radio, my father spoke to my mother. Then my father left with my two uncles and my brother Mukama Janvier, and that was the last time I ever saw them. Another image that is hard for me to forget, it was the first time I saw my mother wearing a pants. After my father left with my brother, my mother wore my father's pants and wrapped the traditional fabric over it. I also remember the meal she prepared for us. It was so good I can't explain it. However, it will be the last meal that my mom will make for us. Soon after that, we began running and looking for places to hide. We would hide from in banana trees, bushes, and the gutter until nighttime. We would stay all day without eating or drinking. Unfortunately, I don't remember the dates or exactly day. However, eventually, my mother told us that we could not go back home. We will have to hide to our neighbors. We couldn't go home because they had burned my father's home down. We will go to the neighbor's house at night. However, during the day, we will go back in the fields. At one time, I was with my mom and 4 of my younger siblings. We continued going back and forth. While in hiding, we would hear sounds of the killers shouting and chanting. We also heard the sounds of the people dying and pleading for their lives. We heard the screams of mothers and children. We were with many people in the hiding. Some would go and never to return. One day we heard the group of killers coming towards us, so we ran frantically in all directions. We got scattered, and that's when I lost contact of my mother and my 2 younger brothers. The struggle continues The struggle continued and got worse, as I now found myself alone. Separate from my family, I had to fend for myself, all the while wondering if my family was dead or alive. I remember crossing over one bridge and looking down. At the bottom of the bridge, I saw a dog eating the human flesh. I crossed the bridge to a place called Chivugiza. I stayed for a few days. When I was terrified. I heard many screams. I saw gunfires going through over the night as if there were stars in the skies. After a few days in that place, I decided to go back near my home. Again, I found myself hiding with many people. None of them were my family members. While hiding there, I heard stories from the men of that house. The stories of how they had rooted my home and slaughtered my father's cows. And that they have brought the meat to the home where I was staying. Immediately after that, I wanted to leave. I couldn't fathom how they were hiding us, yet they were going out and rooting from our homes. One day, the woman of that home took me with her and a group of Hutus who were running away when they heard that RPF were getting nearby. They were also running to another area. So she took me with him. She put an old mattress over my head to cover my face. I moved with them to a nearby town. It was night. The next morning, a man wearing a military boots approached me and asked me who I was. Who was my father? I was so scared to respond. He kicked my leg with his boot. When the lady who took me saw that, she came and took me from him. I don't know what she told him, but she managed to return me back to my uncle's house. Upon reaching my uncle's house, Alphonse's house, I found many people there, including my younger sister and my younger brother and my cousins and my uncle's wife. It was about 15 people in that house. There was one Hutu guy who would bring us food at night. One night we heard a bang on the door, and we thought it was him coming to give us food. However, it was not him. It was a group of angry killers. I remembered it very clearly. It was at night. They looked crazy, a little possessed. They had machetes with blood on them, and they had a baseball bat type of weapon with nails in them. I remember the moonlight lighting the compound as they asked us to get out and line up. They asked for money and said if you give them money, they won't kill us. But it was a lie. My uncle's wife gave them money, and she was the first to be killed. They cut her head off and killed her daughter, who was holding on to her. Her name was Francine. Immediately, it became chaotic. I remember the screams and pleading for our lives. In that process, I was hit in the back of my head with a baseball bat type of weapon. I fell to the ground. They killed a young man who fell on top of me, so I lay there pretending I was dead. I remember saying a little prayer that moment, asking God to spare me. I promised God that I would be a good girl. They continued killing until they finished us. Then went into the house, rooting whatever was left. On their way out, they heard a child crying. One of my aunts had her child on her back when they killed her. So they came back. And I heard them say, let's finish him off. So they did. They killed the child. I continued laying there until I thought it was safe to move. My head was so heavy as I crawled into the house and found my old aunt moaning in pain. They had cut her up in her bed and left her to die. I stayed there all night hearing her moan. Eventually it was silent. The next morning, I went out of the home and saw the dead bodies in the compound. While standing there, I saw 2 cousins of mine among the dead. They had terrible injuries to their heads, but they had survived. Suddenly, we heard footsteps from behind the house. It was my younger sister. She had survived with no scratches. My brother, however, had his hand almost cut off and had a spear wound in the back of his shoulder. My head felt heavy, my white dress was full of blood. My cousin's head were cut open, and somehow we found ourselves on the roadblocks. When they saw us, they looked at us like they have seen a ghost. They all said, "Go away. We don't want your blood on our hands." They said, "Go away now before the others return and kill you." While we were there on the roadblocks, I remember seeing what looks like, I want to say, UN vehicle with French officers and one person pleading with them to take us, but they didn't. At that moment, we separated from our cousins. Me and my brother and my sister went out our separate way. We ended up at a man's home who was a friend of our father, who was a Hutu, and likely he took us in. They began to help us, and they began to help my brother's wound. All this while, we continue hearing screams and dogs running after innocent Tutsis. One day, one of the killers came to his home. My brother was so frightened that he went and ran under the bed. A voice told me to go take him out. So I did. I took him out. And immediately after that, the killer entered the room with a long, it looks like a spear of some sort, and he pushed it under the bed, the places where my brother was. If they had found him, they would have killed us all. After time, we left this man's home in search of the RPF in Hontanyi. We heard that they were nearby. We came back when we didn't see them because we was during the daytime. Then at night, I had a terrible dream. I dreamed that I was sitting on a dining table and that the killers cut me in half against the table. I was woken up by the knock on the door. It was the RPF who came to take us to safety. They took us to a place called Lebero, but we couldn't stay there too long because the enemy was throwing bombs and shooting there. In fact, some people died there. Because of that, the Ngotanyi took us to another place called CND. We stayed there for a few days. Again, people died there because they were throwing bombs in there. So they moved us. They moved us to a camp called in Byumba, where we found our uncle and we stayed with him. When the genocide was over, we came back to Kigali. Soon after that, my older sister and my older brother, who were already in Canada prior to the genocide, arranged for us to join them. So we went to Kenya and began a process of joining them in Canada. I sometimes tell people that the genocide, we often say the genocide took 100 days. And the genocide ended when the RPF took over. But for me and for many survivors, the real struggle began after. For me, the real struggle began after I arrived in Canada. During the genocide, we were kind of in a survival mode. However, in Canada, the reality hit. We were moved from a place where everyone experienced or knew about the genocide and what had happened, to a place where nobody knew what we had experienced. I spent the 10 years crying myself to sleep. I spent 10 years crying myself to sleep. I struggled with the guilt of why I survived, and they didn't. During the genocide against Tutsi, I lost both my parents, my brother Mukama Janvier, my sister Uwera, my brother Rukaka, my brother Emmanuel, my brother Pierre. We lost my grandfather, my aunties, my uncles, and their families. Only this year, in April, I just returned from Rwanda 2 days ago. Only this year is when I was in Rwanda, I found out how my grandfather died by gun, and how my brother died by a stab wound. We never buried my mother. We never found my other 2 siblings, my 2 brothers that were with him. I sometimes feel as though my younger brother is out there. I feel that in my heart. I'll never let that feeling go. My 2 siblings, I sometimes feel those my young brothers are out there. They were only 2 and 4. When you don't bury your family members, you always wonder, what if? In 2009, after many months of sleepless nights, I came back to Rwanda to move my family from the hole they had put them in to the Kigali Memorial Site. The people I'm talking about are the people that were killed the night I spoke about earlier, including my father, that had found him later. What breaks my heart is knowing I didn't meet my paternal grandfather because they were killed and burned in their homes in 1959. And now my children will never meet their grandparents. My father's land remains empty. My father's land remains empty because when they burned the house down, eventually the house broke down. I dream of rebuilding my father's home. I must continue to remember them. I will tell my children of what happened, but I will not teach them to hate. Many here know who I am, but they did not know my story. When they hear it, they are surprised because I'm always happy and smiling. I do that because that's how I chose to remember my family. For me, I remember always, not only in 100 days. I named my child after my mother and my brother. When I see my child, I see them. She's the reason I push on. When she's old enough, I will tell her of the brave men of Inkotanyi who fought hard to save us, many of whom fought hard and only to find that their family members were killed. I don't tell my story because it brings me joy. I do it because it is a duty for me to tell. This is not about me. It's about the story of many. Many who died that can speak for themselves, and many who survived but can't tell their stories yet. I would like to read this. It's entitled Reunion Heart. Since heaven has become your home, I sometimes feel I am alone, so alone. And though we are now afar apart, you hold a big piece of my heart. I never knew how much I would grieve when it was time for you to go, to leave, or just how much my heart would ache from that one fragment you would take. God, let this tender heart remain, reminding me we'll meet again. And one day, all the pain will cease when He restores this missing piece. He returned to joy my every tear. With thoughts of you I hold so dear, and they will become my special way to treasure our reunion day. Twibuke twiyubaka.